foreign affairs and international development, sort of, mostly conflict, not so much development, but it was tied in, but a lot of conflict resolution, conflict mitigation work. I used to work for Ambassador Barton as an intern when I first got out of college, and was a research consultant on the post-conflict reconstruction project, and that got me first into kind of the conflict world. And then I left there and I worked for the World Bank for 3 years. I was in corporate security, so we were providing, we would go onto the ground in these conflict zones, and we would get our own contacts and then get basically intelligence and create analyses and give that to the World Bank president, because they wanted a security assessment separate from their political analysts, to get, like, you know, have multiple streams of analysis coming their way for their decision tree. And that wasn't really going anywhere. So after a couple of years, I was kind of done with that. It was shift work, so it was 24/7. We were manning a watch office and doing crisis response as well. And then I quit and I went backpacking for a year in the Middle East and Africa and in Europe, and that was incredible. I highly recommend doing that if you ever have the opportunity. And then from there, I came back and I went, sorry, I'm getting all these text messages, so I'm going to put it on silent. Then I went volunteering at an orphanage in Cameroon. So learned French and just lived very humbly, and learned a lot about what doesn't work, and how if you don't have connection to a government, you know, you can really struggle to get things done. At least so I thought. Anyway, fast forward, I went to George Mason for graduate school for a master's in conflict analysis and resolution, while I started working for the State Department in what was then the Office of the Coordinator for Reconstruction and Stabilization, SCRS. And then it transitioned into a full bureau, the Conflict and Stabilization Operations. And I was there for 9 years. I focused on Burma or Myanmar for the first 3 years. I deployed there. I was deployed to some of the ethnic states, that's what they call them. And I lived out there as the only American, only diplomat, and we were working on confidence building mechanisms for local ceasefires, and then connecting those local ceasefires to the national dialogue. And then I won't give you everything that I did at the State Department, but I also worked in electoral violence prevention in Nigeria, and then most recently I was the peace process advisor in the Central African Republic. But I quit the State Department last year for like my own kind of personal growth. I really didn't find my a melding of who I am and what I was doing, and felt really, really frustrated with what I was seeing in the countries I was in, and within the United States as well, and felt like the solution or path that I needed to take was to live a more sustainable life, to reconnect with nature at a real tangible level, live in a rural area, and just kind of understand that perspective. So I'm now a flower farmer and an estate gardener and a farmhand. And so I have a completely different perspective now than I did when I was at State Department. And also I'm a year stale from state. So a lot of my perspective, like I have no idea, you know, how state is dealing with COVID, for example. So I'll stop talking there, but that's just kind of my background, my perspective.
So I'll just start with our first question. So given your experience with the State Department, what's one of your most rewarding experiences? And how do you think your perspective has changed through your work abroad?
The most rewarding was, let me take a moment and think here. I worked on Central African Republic for several years, and the most rewarding for sure was getting to work directly with the ambassador and work directly with Central Africans on the peace process. I mean, we were developing negotiation strategies, critical issues to be negotiated within the peace process, and we're right at the cutting edge of what was happening in that country. And so it was a privilege to be so intimately involved in the state of affairs of a country. But the Russians came in and took over the peace process, and it was devastating. So, it was, but I learned, in terms of a lesson, when I had been through processes before in the United States or in the government and the State Department, where I was so emotionally invested that there was no space between who I was and what I was doing. And when the peace process was taken over by the Russians, and I know that's not politically incorrect, and there's many ways to say that differently but that's how it felt at the time. It was more humbling, because it's like I'm just one person. I can do my very best every day, but that's all I can do, and I really can't influence the outcome, because most of the times the dynamics that are at play are so much bigger than that it's almost all ego to think that I really single-handedly could be playing such a fundamental role, particularly when it's not my own country. So I don't know if you got all of that, if that exactly answers your question, but I think that's what comes to mind.
No, that's a perfect answer. So our next question is, would you encourage youth to look into a future in international relations, and why do you think that a career in that specific field could be beneficial?
I think that the more people that we have from diverse backgrounds entering into international affairs, the better we all are for it. I was a suburban DC brat, right? My parents were public service. I had such a specific bubble and perception and perpetuated that bubble because I didn't know any better. So the more youth that we get from all different backgrounds, that from rural areas, from different countries that their families have immigrated here, that can enrichen the breadth of perception into international affairs, foreign policy, the more dynamic that we can become, as opposed to just contributing to have it go down this path unaltered. Because I think unaltered, the path that we're on in terms of international affairs with our power dynamics and power centers is not sustainable. So hold on one second. Brisbane, go away. Sorry. So I definitely think I wanted to do foreign affairs since I was 11, and that's what I wanted to do. Now in converse, I feel that the best thing for me is to go local and to understand that dynamic, and that's my best path. But if they have the passion and unique perspectives, then definitely go for it.
Yeah. So wait, Rahul, did you want to ask a question or was?
No. Just go on with the next one.
Oh, okay. So our next question is, using your experience with the State Department, how have you seen and how have you yourself worked to promote American values or the American foreign policy strategy abroad?
Well, that was pretty much my job, right? So I think, oops, I don't know what just happened. Oh, okay. A peaceful transfer of power is the easiest way to answer that. We, on the one side of the spectrum, there's the idea that if you have a corrupt, really awful governing system, that sometimes the only way to overcome that is revolution, and violence is necessary in order to disrupt the current state of order. Now, I wouldn't say I'm completely dissuaded of that, but just based on my own experience, the toll that violence plays on the human psyche, on communities, on nations that have repetitive cycles of violence is extraordinary. And so offering, through what has worked for us, democratic processes, forums to discuss deep-seated issues, though we don't practice that very much here in the United States, I think that minimizing the use of violence to change governance structure is probably, I don't know if that's an American value, but it's certainly an American operational system. Is, was easy to, palpable for me to understand and like pass on without it feeling like I was shoving American values down another country's throat.
All right. That's a great answer. That's what we're, looking for. And but like this next question, I know you said that like you're not really up to date with what's happening with coronavirus in the State Department, but this is really based off your own experiences you've had in other countries. So and we also want to ask more about current events. So how do you expect COVID-19 to impact international relations, especially in the developing world?
Well, if you look at the kind of main power centers, China, the United States, Russia, and the EU. The EU is being crippled. The United States is being crippled. China suffered. I can't say if they've been crippled, but they certainly, I could probably say, like, based on their the economic toll, like, we're all getting crippled. We're all not doing well. And I think that just based on my experience in seeing conflicts in other countries, this is going to invite both opportunities for collaboration and increased competition. So there's going to be, opposing forces within each country that will find out, like, it's not one way or the other. There's going to be, I imagine, opportunities that will be followed up for greater collaboration between the United States and and China on preventing this type of thing from happening again. That's a lie. I don't think that that's actually going to happen. But I don't have a good example, but I think that there probably are ways, just how we have the entire time, and just like when we were like in the Cold War with the USSR, there's always strands of cooperation that breed from conflict. And I see that that's probably will continue. Will this so fundamentally shift the power dynamics in the world? I think it's too early to tell. We don't really know what the damage is in the United States, but it's certainly the most damaging, impact, not damaging impact. It's certainly the most damaging sequence of actions that's happened in recent history to the United States. And it's not a single wound like September 11, but an enduring, festering wound. So, so I think that our weakness will impact the foreign relations. I think that the leadership is going to have a big role to determine whether or not our collective weaknesses reinforce a collaborative mindset or a competitive. And so that's true. I mean, it's clearly in the United States even been where we're all going through this horrible thing that's impacting all of us equally in distinct ways. And there's still a divisiveness on like whether or not this is all China's fault, whether or not the president is handling this exceptionally well or he's doing a horrible job. I mean, it's being so politicized. So that doesn't give me much faith that we're going to go in the collaborative direction. In terms of the international, the developing world. So when just as when we had the Great War, when we had Cold War, what's happening at the global power dynamic level is they're going to manipulate that, and that will manifest itself in the way that they interact with the developing world. So this might mean, there's reduced willingness to give material supplies because of risk of infection or whatever. Like there might be measures put in place to reduce contact on foreign assistance, so that that could be an issue. On the other hand, developing countries would most feasibly be super hardly hit based on the way that the virus works. And so that gives a lot of NGOs a lot of money because there'll be donor support to help to like funnel to the developing world. I mean, I think usually what we see is that when countries are suffering themselves, they're less likely to support other countries. And so I would imagine there's going to be a dip in foreign assistance, from the US and elsewhere besides humanitarian assistance. So there'll be an increase in humanitarian assistance and then a decrease in the preventative and response, like conflict response and governance and all the things that you need in order to build up a country to ensure that it's like healthy will probably all be decreased. In terms of the power dynamics, it depends on, I've been loosely following what's been happening in Yemen, and, some conflicts are going to take, like, the parties are going to take advantage of the world looking the other way. And they might also take advantage of this as like a planning time. Okay, we're basically been part of this timeout, so let's recoup. And, so I could imagine that, dependent on how the virus hits or not in the winter, that you're going to see like upticks in violence eventually. Like there'll start to be a wave of where the warring groups are like, yeah, we still have these issues. Like this guy's still an asshole. I'm not like I put my sword down for a minute, but like, come on. So, I think that we will probably see a resurgence in violence to the degree that it actually decreased, which I have no idea if that's true or not, because I haven't seen statistics. I think that's all I got.
That's perfect.
Yeah. So just going off how you said that aid from certain nations to the developing world would decrease, we saw President Trump announce that we would be cutting funding to the WHO. So given how much the U.S. contributes in terms of funding, how do you think that'll impact as a precedent, and more in the short term, how do you think it'll impact the WHO's actions across the globe?
From the news source that I picked up that information from, it was basically cast as a political decision based on criticism of Trump. And so I don't even know how connected that is to although it probably could be strewn as we need to take care of ourselves. So even though that didn't seem to be the origin of the decision making. So I don't know if the decision to pull funding from who necessarily is indicative of what the funding levels will be for other types of foreign assistance. But in terms of, but specific to the WHO, I'm sure another country like Australia, or maybe a handful of countries that have been waiting for the U.S. to maybe not, that's not the right way to say it, are going to take an opportunity to play more of a leadership role in yet another multilateral institution that the U.S. is predominant. So, but it's to the extent that the United States I mean, it's another indicator of the United States removing itself from multilateral organizations, which are supposed to be playing a counterbalance to unilateral governance. So it's like, it's not, I don't think it's a great sign.
All right. And so since you yourself, you had a former career in the State Department and in international relations, you worked in many countries. How would you advise a student like us who's interested in pursuing a career in the field of international relations? What specific steps should they take now and later on in their life if they want to go into the same career that you had?
What's your age group?
Like high school and college students, so anywhere from 16 to 20, 22.
Yeah. Well, language is huge. I myself have felt limited. I have French, but it's not very good. And that has definitely limited my abilities, and just like very frustrating to not be able to communicate with the people that with their native tongue within the countries that you're trying to work on. I think experiential learning is hugely important to help you figure out what you like and what you don't like. I guess beyond giving you kind of the typical, like, do an internship, get time abroad, I would really spend some really deep thinking of what are your motivations, like what is going to sustain you through when you can't get a job. Grad school's like way too expensive and not an option right now, or like, what is your motivation? Is it to make the world a better place? Break that down. How exactly do you want to make the world a better place? What are the issues that you see that are critical? What comparative advantage do you have from your lens that you want to continue to build off of? If I had sat and kind of done more deep critical thinking, I'm not sure I would have even stayed in the career as long as I did, because I was too afraid to answer those like deep, dark, looming questions in my head that were like really wanting to kind of give me more specific guidance of what my path was. And so I think that reflective practice, once a year, taking the time to like do your vision board, chart out your life, like figure out where your values are and how your values could align with your pursuit in this career path. Now that might not sound specific to international relations, but when we're talking about, we're trying to influence other people. So you really, really need to have a strong understanding of who you are and what your core values are if you're going to maximize your ability to succeed, because you're bringing out your best gifts.
All right. Thank you so much for that. And just before we wrap up, I want to ask a question that's has nothing really to do with politics or international relations. So you said earlier that you went backpacking through Europe and Africa. And I actually went backpacking with my family the last 2 summers in Spain and Italy. So I wanted to ask you, what's your most favorite country that you've been to while backpacking?
Lebanon.
Lebanon.
Yeah, we went in 2010, and so it was a year before the Syria war, and we could just walk all over the country. I mean, there was a couple of times where we checked under our car to see if there was a bomb, because we were very clearly not in a good place. But, I was taking tea with Hezbollah leaders and listening to the call to prayers at sunset in ancient ruins. And I mean, it was just unbelievable. And it's just the Lebanon conflict is really, really fascinating to me. And it's also just very beautiful and great food and small and easily, you can travel around. I know things continue to shift in Lebanon, but I think I really enjoy. We also did Eastern Turkey, so up against the border with Armenia, and then further down with Iran. And I enjoy going to places that are not well traveled by Americans or Westerners, because you just see people are people. Like, they're talking about their boyfriends or girlfriends or like their mom's birthday that they missed and whatever, and you're like in the like, but they're wearing these traditional gowns in this like mountain town where no one's been, and you're like, what? So it's, I really enjoy those types of experiences.
All right. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us.
Sure.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thing.
All right. So just